Amplifiers and DACs are everywhere. You can't go 2 months without another product to think about. SMSL, Topping, and countless generic Chinese companies have tons of products, and no doubt many more ready for release. At some point, you just have to ask yourself if there's one amp or DAC that will be enough for you. The idea behind amplifier and DAC stacks is that you can control one component or another. If you dislike the DAC, then you can change it. If you like a more powerful amp, then you can replace it. To that end, Topping previously released the D50s and the A50s amplifier and DAC. I already reviewed the D50s and found that it is a good, sturdy, neutral DAC. APOS Audio generously loaned me the A50s to review. This standalone amplifier costs about $220 and is the matching pair to the D50. APOS and I have a continuing relationship where they send me gear from time to time to review and return. I've personally purchased many items from APOS and think it is a good alternative to Amazon. If you're looking for gear, take a glance at APOS Audio. So, is the A50s a worthwhile consideration or just another Chinese product in an already noisy market? The A50s is a revision of the A50. But Topping says that the S outshines the original in nearly every way. If you go to the APOS website, you'll see some comparative specs. For example, the S has an SNR of 0.0007%, while the original A50 had an SNR of 0.0004%. Whoop-de-doo. The S also has a maximum of 3.5 watts into 32 ohms, which is a significant deviation from the original amp, which had about 2 watts. The S has both a balanced 4.4mm and a 1/4-inch jack output. Their output impedance is under 0 ohms. As power output goes, the single-ended provides 1.4 watts at 32 ohms and 192 milliwatts into 300 ohms. This is not groundbreaking, especially if you consider that Schitt's $100 Magni provides double the output into 32 ohms. However, through the balanced output, the S gives you 3.5 watts into 32 ohms and 760 milliwatts into 300 ohms. But before you get too excited, there is a catch. Your DAC has to pump out 4 VRMS for those numbers to appear. If your DAC has the typical 2 VRMS output, then the S provides just under 2 watts into 32 ohms and 208 milliwatts into 300 ohms from the balanced output. Topping has a lot of measurements for you to review. Overall, in function, the A50s is a simple amp. But let's be realistic. The noise floor numbers are utterly useless. I have said this many times. Your frail human ears cannot pick up distortion that is well below 1%, and studies have shown that the noise has to be at least as loud as the music you're listening to for you to be able to hear that noise. So while some might get super excited about atomic level SNR and THD numbers, they have no bearing whatsoever in what you actually perceive. But if you get kicks from numbers rather than music, then Audio Science Review has a glowing review of the A50s, and you should take a glance at it. Then there's the little issue about the balanced output. Well, there are actually 2 issues. First, it's a bit confusing when Topping says that the A50s has 3.5 watts when you'll need a DAC that pumps out much greater voltage than normal. I mean, take a look at your sub-$200 DAC options. Most have around 2 VRMS. It's a bit amusing, since Topping's matching DAC, the D50s, has an output level of 2 VRMS. So, if you bought the A50s with the D50s, you would not get 3.5 watts. The second issue about the balanced output is that it's not true balanced. The A50s has only RCA input. While RCA is perfectly fine, you're getting more limited in finding a matching DAC that will get you 4 VRMS. For example, the Schitt Modius has 4 VRMS output but only through the balanced XLR. Anyway, when you consider the distinct voltage issue, then the D50s features seem to be a bit less impressive than they look on the website. That being said, the A50s has no frills. You get 1 RCA input, 1 RCA pre-out, a gain selector, and a volume knob. The A50s is built as sturdily as the D50s. This amp is heavy and encased in thick metal. You could easily bludgeon someone with either of these devices. The volume knob turns smoothly. The gain selector is the power switch as well. You just need to briefly tap the power button to activate high or low gain. High gain gives you a 6 decibel boost. There really is not much to say about the build. It is simple, unpretentious, and downright functional. Overall, the features are not that impressive. A normal audiophile has no need to be excited by the SNR and THD numbers, and the 3.5 watt output is severely limited by the voltage a DAC can feed the amp, so don't expect that power if your DAC has 2 VRMS. On the other hand, the build is great. There's nothing to complain about in this regard, and frankly, it's impressive how sturdy the A50s feels. In order to test the sound signature, I paired the A50s to the D50s, which was still on loan to me by APOS. I used my Avantone planar, one of the most neutral headphones I've heard. I connected the planar using my Hart audio cable kit through 4.4mm balanced output. The DAC was connected to my Windows 10 PC. I had the A50s on high gain, and I made sure that the D50s was sending full signal to the amp. I played music through Amazon Music HD. The D50s is a neutral DAC. I already spoke about this when I reviewed that product, and if you're interested, go watch that review. The planar has a slight sub-bass roll-off but otherwise neutral presentation. Consequently, if the A50s adds any coloration, I should be able to pick it up. My overall impression is that the A50s is a neutral amplifier. The bass is tight and unaccented. In other words, there is no mightiness or emphasis or de-emphasis in the bass region. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, the planar rendered the sub-bass rumble from the beginning of the song, but it was a bit recessed and not quite as loud as it should have been. This is the exact presentation that the planar has with all other neutral sources. The organ was powerful and cut through the other instruments during the crescendo. There was marginal melding among instruments, but I could easily pick out individual elements when I listened carefully. In Conquer by Overwork, the combo of the topping stack and planar resulted in a tight, precise rendition of the multiple drums in this track. All drums had fast, accurate energy. I could hear the various tonalities of the different drums. The synth was not harsh or fatiguing. I listened to Irodori by the Japanese drum band Kodo, numerous hip-hop songs such as Pure Water, Nupatek, and Reel It In, and a smorgasbord of other bassy tracks. On each occasion, the topping stack presented fast, tight, accurate drums. The planar was not able to fully recreate sub-bass when it was part of a given song. This, of course, is par for the course for the planar and does not reflect on the A50s's performance. The mids also appear to be neutral on the A50s. I listened to Orla Gartland's Why Am I Like This and Haim's Want You Back to determine if there was any emphasis in sibilants. There was none. Vocals, both male and female, were full and neutral. The sibilance was also neutral, not emphasized or de-emphasized. Instruments had natural timbre and decay. Guitars, drums, pianos, bass, ukuleles, all mid-centric instruments seemed to have accurate timbre. There was no muddiness or harshness. Multiple vocalists were generally easy to differentiate. Slight strumming of guitar strings were immediately audible. The various tonalities and characteristics of different vocalists was clear and seemed to be uncolored. As for treble, the A50s has neutral presentation. I listened to Scherzo for X-Wings, Flight from the City, Take 5, and numerous orchestral and classical pieces. Horns and brass always sounded full. Their biting, grainy, nasally signatures were unaltered. They cut through the other instruments. Saxophones sounded full though not harsh. Cellos had a smooth but clear rendition. Cymbal crashes were crisp and undistorted. Even at high volume, near or just beyond safe listening levels, the A50s never made anything sound harsh or peaky or fatiguing. I would not recommend listening to music on these volumes, but you can without the fear of ear-piercing treble, depending on your headphones, of course. Detail retrieval on the A50s is about average. This is not an analytical amplifier. In contrast, the Monolith THX Desktop and THX Portable have a more analytical tilt. Indeed, even the Earman TR amp has a more analytical sound than the A50s. The Monolith and Earman products have a slight push in treble and a slight reduction of bass. This sometimes results in some details appearing a bit more obviously. Treble will stand out just a hair more on these products, and any details in that region will be a bit more noticeable than on the A50s. But the A50s does not hide or muddy the sound. You will not struggle to hear details. By contrast, again, if you use the Chord Mojo or AudioQuest Dragonfly Red, you will get a warmer, more colored sound. Both of these products tend to hide micro details, and even some obvious details are less than clear. In short, the A50s is neither analytical or warm. It simply does an adequate, perfectly normal job at presenting details. Now, the big question about power output. This is where things get a little bit shaky. The volume knob on the A50s is on mute at around 7 o'clock. It turns to maximum all the way around to 5 o'clock. The gain boost adds another 6 decibels to both single-ended and balanced output. So far, we have discussed the robust build and neutral sound. But the A50s is $220. And under this price range, you can find far more powerful amplifiers, such as the Schiit Magni and Magni S. The Avantone Planar is a typical large planar driver headphone and requires a bit of juice to get it going. Indeed, Avantone recommends at least 250 milliwatts for optimum performance. While I had the D50s outputting full signal and I had the A50s on high gain, I consistently had to keep the volume knob at least at 9 o'clock for moderate volume. But at this setting, the planar sounded just a little bit veiled, so I decided to listen to all my tracks at around 11 o'clock on the volume knob. This still provided safe listening volume, but was reaching the limit of what I should let my ears experience. At 11 o'clock, the planar had its clarity back. I tested numerous headphones on the A50s to determine whether it can drive them. The simple answer is yes, the A50s does drive most headphones just fine. The HD6XX and 660S, LCD2, Monolith M1570, Bear Dynamic T1, they all got sufficient power for peak performance. All of these headphones became quite loud without having to resort to maximum volume on the A50s, and this was both over single-ended and balanced. The Modhouse Argon, on the other hand, is a special breed of headphones. I really wish people would look at the specifications and read the Fostex and Modhouse FAQ about this headphone. The Argon needs at least 1 watt of power for peak performance, and Fostex recommends up to 3 watts. And this is going to be a problem for some. If your Argon is not modified for balanced connection, then you will never get the peak power from the A50s. Single-ended maxes out at 485 milliwatts into 32 ohms from a traditional 2 VRMS DAC. That's well shy of the bare minimum you need to achieve the most out of your Argon. But when you compare the A50s to the Schiit Magni and the Magni S, you notice that the situation is rather different. The Magni has 1.6 watts into 50 ohms, which is well above the minimum peak requirement for the Argon. And the Magni has only single-ended output. The Magni S has 1.3 watts into 50 ohms from single-ended and 3.2 watts into 50 ohms from balanced. And by the way, Schiit does not require you to use 4 VRMS DACs to achieve these numbers on the single-ended connection. While the A50s has respectable power output, I have no doubt that the vast majority of headphones will pair just fine with it. There's no hiss or noise at all, either from the single-ended or the balanced connection. But you do have to put this amplifier in the context. You will never achieve the advertised 3.5 watts unless you have a DAC that outputs 4 VRMS or higher. And as I said before, even Topping's matching D50s DAC is only 2 VRMS. Go figure. I should also mention that my A50s has a slight channel imbalance issue at very low volume. On every headphone I tested, both using balanced and single-ended, the A50s exhibits imbalance when audio is audible just above mute. The left channel is silent while the right channel plays. A marginal increase in volume results in channel balance again. This is likely not going to be an issue for most, but just keep it in mind. It's always good to have competition. The more meaningful options we have, the more we can force companies to drive down costs and prices, and the more features we should see in newer products. That's the theory anyway. My go-to company for value to performance is Schiit. These guys make excellent products for affordable prices and cater to the whole spectrum of audiophiles. I keep hoping for a competitor to Schiit so that Schiit will start implementing a few changes to their product line. Topping and SMSL should be in the correct position to challenge the Schiit monopoly. You would think that with Chinese manufacturing and fairly liberal use of other companies' designs, Chinese brands could go toe-to-toe with the small American brand. But the more I look at topping and SMSL products of recent, the more confused I become. What are these guys after? I just don't see the game plan. It appears to me that they are uncertain which audience they want to capitalize on and are running in opposite directions at once. Take the A50s and D50s as examples. These products are really well made. They're compact, they're physically faultless, at least in my experience. They have good availability and decent warranty. But the performance is nothing exceptional. This would not be a problem if the A50 or the D50 cost $50 or $100 less than they actually do. But at more than $200 for each of these products, topping has to provide some compelling reasons for people to buy these things. This brings us to value. I don't see it. I'm sorry, I wish I could say that there's value in the A50s, but I'm struggling with it. I appreciate APOS sending me gear to review, but I simply cannot tell people to buy a product that is simply overpriced for what it does. This has no reflection on APOS. Kudos to them for letting me review gear, as they clearly know my personality and viewpoints. So I'm focusing all of this entirely on topping. There are two ways to look at the A50s. First, as a standalone amp. Second, as part of a stack. Let's analyze both. As a standalone amp, the A50s is $100 more expensive than the Magni, but provides less power. And I don't understand that. Yes, I see that the A50s has a 4.4mm output, but it's not true balanced. You're still limited to RCA input. In order to enjoy the A50's balanced output, you will need to buy balanced cables or have your unbalanced headphones modified for balanced connection. That's additional cost. But on the Magni, it's essentially plug-and-play power. You can look at the Magnius as well. I have not reviewed this product. I would love to someday, so everything I'm about to say is based entirely on the specifications for the Magnius. Here you have the Magnius, which is still a bit cheaper than the A50s, and yet the Magnius has true balanced input and output, greater power output as well. And you can get balanced DACs with 4 VRMS through the XLR output for the Magnius's XLR input. But power is not necessarily an issue for everyone. In fact, the power that the Magni provides is likely overkill for a good chunk of audiophiles. So what about the sound signature and other performance? Well, the A50s is neutral and has inaudible noise, but that's similar to the Magni and many other amplifiers we've seen in recent years. You could argue that the A50s has extremely low noise measurements, and to that I would merely say, who cares? THD under 1% is inaudible. Getting lower and lower measurements is a painfully obvious indication that companies are pandering to a certain sect of audiophiles to the detriment of those who will pay real money for usable features. I have never accepted the notion that subatomic levels of THD and SNR have any effect on sound. It simply does not. So, while commendable that topping is able to achieve molecular size measurements, it's not actually a meaningful selling point, at least in my opinion. Thus, as a standalone amplifier, the A50s does nothing groundbreaking. Let's take a very brief look at the A50s in a stack system, and in this instance I paired the A50 to the D50. The D50s is about $250. The A50s is $220. Your total grand cost is under $500 before taxes and shipping. As I said, the D50s works just fine. There's nothing to complain about in its performance and build. But it's really quite odd that this matching DAC, one which costs $250, is not balanced and does not have the higher VRMS that the A50s needs to achieve the marketed 3.5 watt power output. You could pair the A50s to another cheaper DAC and get perfectly good performance, But unless that alternative DAC has 4 VRMS through RCA, you still will not get the power that you're promised. You could buy conversion cables and use noise attenuation boxes and try to hook up balanced XLR to the A50s, but you're adding complexity and cost. Look, there are plenty of positives for the topping products. Even with the power output issue on the A50s, the product itself is rock solid. What bothers me is the cost to performance. If you're the type that is not concerned about such things and you like the form factor and overall design of the A50s, then it's a fine product. But for anyone looking for cost-effective performance, I think that the A50s probably should not be on your top 5 list. I'm not saying that you should disregard it altogether. Instead, I'm cautioning you against blindly accepting marketing and hype from some corners. The A50s is a good product. It does what it needs to do, but I think it's overpriced, and I think that its 3.5 watt output specification is a little bit misleading, considering you have to really go out of your way to find a matching DAC that can help provide that power.